Welcome to the Smallholding Revolution podcast, where we look at the journey from no house to buying farmland to building your own home and life on your very own smallholding. So, I'd like to introduce my podcast partners, compadres, pioneers.
Pioneers. That's the phrase.
This is Scotty, and this is David, and we are at various stages of our journey from nothing to smallholding. I'm at the nothing stage, looking to buy land and start that whole part of the journey. David's a little bit further along. He has bought land. And Scotty has been living on his farm for the last 10 years and is working on building a house with the weird and wonderful journey of planning permission.
Very weird and wonderful, yeah.
And we'll get to that in a bit. But I know there are so many of you who are at various stages of this journey, but I really wanted to support those who are at the very beginning. Can you buy land and build your own house in it?
Hell yeah!
Absolutely. And we're going to show you how.
Exactly.
We're going to take you on our process.
Have to give you the caveat, it's not easy, it's not overnight, but it can be done. And we'd love to support you on your journey and invite you to join us on our journey as we do exactly what we're going to be talking about on this podcast over the next few weeks, months, years. There's lots of
decades.
Decades.
It's a lifetime journey, actually, isn't it? Really.
Exactly. And the original pioneer with this whole idea and this whole juggernaut journey of helping people to go from nothing to smallholding farm. It's you, David.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Dave. Great to meet you all. So when we were discussing how we were going to set up this podcast and what we were going to cover, one of the first things that was mentioned was that it would be good to talk about the history of smallholding and how I in particular came to my idea of helping people to get back onto land, those who want to do that. And we were just discussing earlier on about the background to all of this. And I'm sure some of you probably know, but others might not know that for many years, obviously thousands of years, people particularly in the UK, and I'm talking from a UK perspective here, but I'm sure this applies to many parts of the world, but in the UK, most people lived on small holdings, little farmsteads, small communities, village communities. Only a small proportion of people lived in cities and urban areas. And then in the 1700s in the UK, Britain experienced, following the Enlightenment period, Britain experienced the first industrial revolution, as it's called, with the invention of things like the steam engine. The printing press was slightly earlier, but which was very useful for disseminating information, a bit like the modern internet today. But the steam engine, the looms, and all sorts of other fantastic inventions. And that resulted in a requirement for people to live in cities. Now, when I did history at school, we were taught that people flocked to the cities. They demanded to go and live in these cities, mainly in slums. And I always thought,
they didn't?
Well, I always thought it was quite strange. So on one hand, we were taught that people flocked to the cities, and then we were taught that the conditions in the cities were slum conditions. And yet, we've all been to lovely villages in the Cotswolds or Norfolk and Suffolk, and in fact, many people go and stay in Airbnbs in these very villages today, paying a lot of money to get the experience of staying in a beautiful countryside, bucolic village. So you think to yourself, well, why would they leave? And of course, what isn't as common...
Better chips. Better chips in London.
Probably. Manchester and Birmingham and Bolton and Oldham. But actually, what happened was there was a period of time where successive laws were passed, and these were called the Enclosures Acts in the 1700s. And prior to this, if you lived on the land, you would have access to the common lands, which were common grazing lands and common woodlands. So people living in villages, they'd have their own plots. They would work on the land, on the lord of the manor's lands, and they didn't have money as such, or what we would now class as money. In fact, banknotes only were formed in, I think, the 1600s. for the first time. Prior to that, real money was gold and silver. Anything else was just debt notes. There was no money as such other than real gold and silver. So these people would pay for their and get paid in terms of a tithe, either tithe barns in the church. They would put a portion of their own crops aside, and if they were working for the landlord, they could be paid in food and crops. But also they would have their own lands and access to the common lands. And the common lands, they would be able to get their wood for burning, their wood for making furniture, fences, that sort of thing,
so
houses.
Like feed their crops and have their
everything, animals grazing,
okay.
and it was all managed amongst the community.
Okay.
Then the Enclosures Act basically enclosed those areas off. And during that period, this is purely a theory. I mean, I haven't got any evidence for this. I wasn't around in the 1700s. But people were then in a position, if you imagine, you've now no longer got access to this free grazing, this free access to wood and coppice that you've been managing, your family's been managed for years.
So the government made it illegal for you to go on there and do what you need to do to gather wood and feed your animals and whatever. So,
and if you go to, there are a number of museums. There's a museum in Nottingham, and it's a museum, it's in the old Nottingham jail, and you can actually see some of the records for where people were arrested for stealing a rabbit, snaring a rabbit or a hare, and then transported to Australia for that crime. Same thing for
being hungry.
For being hungry and feeding themselves on an animal that lives wild anyway, which historically they would have always had access to. Yeah. So by enclosing these lands, you forced the so-called serfs, peasants, the equivalent of people like us, to effectively have no option but to move to somewhere where they could earn money, new money. And the great thing about that is ultimately that it's all, can be taxed and taken away from you. Okay. But these people then had no choice but to leave the land because the land couldn't sustain them anymore. Yeah. And of course...
Or what they had access to.
What they now had access to. Yeah. At the same time, in places like Norfolk, there was the Earls of Leicester were developing four-course rotation. So it's a farming system where you followed crops, legumes, and root crops. So cereal, legumes, root crops, and then fallow in a series to cycle it. So for that to work, they needed larger areas of land. So they had to enclose more areas and keep the serfs off.
Okay.
Yeah, and then of course the linen and wool trade, the wool trade in particular, meant that more lands were needed for sheep. So the sheep farmers, the big landowners, were then running sheep on lands which previously would have been used for grazing. Okay. So as a result of that, the lands were enclosed. The people had no option but to move to the towns and cities. Okay.
Or get a free holiday to Australia.
Free holiday to Australia.
Busting a rabbit.
That was followed up with the Highland clearances, even more sheep on the land. You can look at Google Maps and see all the deserted crofts, hundreds of thousands of them over Scotland, all now deserted as the big estates were amalgamated and the people were shipped off to the colonies. Yeah. Then it was followed up with the Irish famine, during which the British government were